Good evening. My name is John Yap with the City of Iowa City, here to introduce the firm Opticos, represented by Dan Perolik. Dan, thank you, and John Meeke. Opticos is a firm from Berkeley, California, specializing in architecture, urban design, and planning. Another member of their team who was not able to make it, he was snowed in the Northeast, is Rick Chelman. And he will be focusing on parking and transportation in the study areas. The City of Iowa City has hired Opticos to conduct an analysis both of the Northside Neighborhood and the South District neighborhood, two very different neighborhoods. Tonight's focus is on the Northside neighborhood, and would like to thank all of you for coming. Tonight is their first public meeting of what will be a 6 to 9 month process in their analysis of these two neighborhoods. They've spent the day getting the lay of the land, taking a lot of photographs, and starting to hear from people such as yourselves. Thanks again for coming, and with that, I'll turn it over to Dan Perolik.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you for being the diehards and coming out to this public meeting on Valentine's Day. It's great to be back. Can I get a show of hands? I was here last May, and I gave a presentation on form-based coding in this room and missing middle housing. Can I get a show of hands of those of you who were there or maybe saw it on public television? Because apparently it's been looping on public television, so maybe a third of you. So that just gives me a better sense of, I just want to make sure I'm not repeating myself, but also want to make sure I'm sort of giving everybody a solid foundation for as this project progresses. I'm just really excited to be back. It was really evident after my last trip here that this is a community that's really, really passionate about their historic neighborhoods. And I always really love to see that. And having grown up in the Midwest, it also is nice to be back because in a lot of ways it feels like coming back home. So it's good to be back in the Midwest. And so a couple of things is we got a chance, when I was here last summer, I always just, whether I'm on foot running through a neighborhood or out getting a tour in a car, I've actually gotten to know, obviously not as well as you guys, but I've gotten a pretty decent sense of the framework of the Northside neighborhood. And today, in particular, we got a great driving tour, and that in addition to the sort of the running that I did through your neighborhood the last time I was here, we stopped on Brown Street, got out of the car, and then walked down Van Buren and kind of wiggled back and forth through the gridded street network. But it's really clear that you have a really special place here. We're excited to be here, as John said, kicking off this process. This is the first of 3 public meetings over the course of the next 6+ months. We will be back in town 2 more times, and this will be a continuing dialogue with you. But we, as the initiation of a process like this, we know that this is just a starting point in a long conversation with you all, but we like to encourage you all to get some of your thoughts down on paper. That sort of gets us up to speed fairly quickly and of understanding the context of your neighborhood, what you like about it, what you think improvements could be made or issues that it has. And that establishes a really great foundation for us to move forward, to think more specifically about the recommendations that we'll make. So I'm going to be tag teaming actually with John, and he's going to start off by giving you an overview of tonight's workshop. And then he'll talk a little bit about the background, some of the initial analysis we did, and we'll go through this survey that's on your table. And then he's going to hand that off to me, and I'm going to talk more specifically about some of the more technical pieces in terms of what is a form-based code and what is missing middle housing, and sort of just plant some seeds in terms of that. So now I'm going to hand it off to John.
Thank you, Dan. So again, as Dan said, thank you everyone for coming out. We really do appreciate both people coming out, and especially since it is Valentine's Day. I'm going to give an introduction. We're going to do a visual survey, which all of you should have a little handout that's double-sided with some photographs on it. I'll give a little bit of presentation about walkability and what it means to us. And then as Dan was saying, he'll talk about some technical details. And then we're going to ask you to take the maps that are in front of you and start to mark them up. And this is an exercise some of you may be familiar with. We'll ask you to put dots on the map that things that you like, things that maybe need a little bit of work, opportunity sites. And then most importantly are the pens at the table where we're asking you to mark up the maps with notes and comments, different things that help us start to get a better understanding of the Northside neighborhood. So as John said, this is the first of 3 trips. It's really about us starting to understand your community. We had a little bit of knowledge both from Dan's previous trip, from working with staff on a basic framework of a scope. We will be coming back twice more, where we are going to be exploring these topics with you all. So we'll take the input we get today, what we've heard from, what we hear from you all, what we'll hear tomorrow night from the South District, what we heard from stakeholders, and we'll bring back and we'll tell you what we heard. We'll also tell you what we've started to analyze. So what did we get from looking at these maps? What do we get from looking at the information the city has in their database of information? So we'll come back and talk to you about that. Ask for feedback again. At that trip, we'll start to present some tools that we can use. We'll take that feedback. We'll come back one more time, present again things that we heard, and ask for feedback. The culmination of all of this effort is really a report on recommendations for next steps. So that's where we'll be heading as we move forward in this project. For tonight, we're talking specifically about the north side. So we're talking about from Jefferson at the south side up to the parcels just north of Brown Street to the north, Clinton to the west, and Governor to the east. That's where we're focusing tonight's presentation. But as John mentioned, we have another consultant who's working with us, Rick Chelman. He'll be looking at parking issues. And so he'll be looking at the north side, but in addition, he'll be looking at part of the east side of east side neighborhoods. So he'll be studying that and coming back with some recommendations. One of the things that we recognized really quickly is that you all have an incredible street grid. You have this great street grid that's consistent across your neighborhoods. You have alleys. Some of the alleys are in good shape. Some of them maybe not in the best shape. But you have this wonderful fabric. It's consistent. It ties together all your neighborhoods, even though each neighborhood is distinct. And we understand from these maps that you all have identified the fact that you have different places in your community in the north side that have specific qualities. So this is just summary of the historic districts that you have in place and the conservation districts. And I'll talk about these a little bit more later in the presentation. What I'd love everyone to do is spend about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, take the visual survey that's in front of you and just quick reactions. Do you like the building? Do you not like the building? We've got a little bit of space for you to add some notes about maybe, is there anything in particular that you like or don't like? Points to anyone who can circle all the buildings that are from Iowa City, because some of the buildings are not actually from Iowa City, but they are from the region. We did not bring any photographs from California with us. And again, this is just quick initial reaction. Our intent with this is we're not using this as a preference that the community only wants this style architecture or this size building. It's more, again, for us to understand from you all what you see, what you like. And it'll build into a little bit of what Dan will talk about later with building types. So I'm going to jump ahead with the presentation. If you need a little bit of time, feel free to go ahead and put in the last check marks. So one of the things that we identified and we have heard is that walkable cities. The north side is a very walkable community, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But one thing that's happening nationwide and is also evident here in Iowa City is that walkable cities, or parts of cities that are walkable, are really starting to thrive. People are coming back into them. A lot of younger people are moving back to them, whether they're students or they're recent graduates. And they are a place that there is a lot of renewed interest. We also recognize and we've heard that with that interest comes development pressure. And so you all have Historic districts have been in place for a little while, and you have historic districts that have been put in place recently in the last few years. And when we talked earlier about walkability, and I talked about your street network, I mean, this is the north side here with this incredible network of streets and alleyways, really consistent 50-foot lots, 40-foot lots, sometimes 80-foot lots from the historic pattern, pretty consistent depth. It really it comes from a time when cities were planned for people walking, right? This was a time when, horse and buggy was around and not cars when this was planned out. But what makes it walkable? So part of it is that you have commercial streets that are really appealing and vibrant. These are not photos of Iowa City. We will replace these with photos. I was asking Courtney Sawyer from our office is here today as well, and she was out documenting a lot today, but we were not able to slip in the Iowa City photos. But you have these things. You have buildings that have active frontages, that have glass, that have shops. You have tables out on the streets. You have street trees. The north side has an incredibly beautiful tree canopy along so many of the streets. On-street parking, narrower travel lanes, not always the case in all of the north side, but exists. And that there's generally a sense of enclosure. Photograph here of a building in Iowa City that Dan took last time I was here. A beautiful building, historic building, provides great eyes on the street, activity along the ground floor. Photograph not from Iowa City, of buildings that really aren't contributing. They're just blank walls, landscaping that really is only there to soften the hard edge of a building. We recognize that your historic districts have some great regulations that talk about making sure you have active frontage, you have windows, you have doors, you have porches and stoops. But we also recognize that not all of the north side actually benefits from that, because not all of the north side is under a historic district or conservation district. You have complete streets, right? You all have streets. You have started across your city to incorporate bicycle lanes, better sidewalks throughout the community. You have transit. Again, these are not photographs from Iowa City, but we'll replace these with photos from Iowa City. And I think the key here is that it's thinking about pedestrians, but everyone from the young children that are here today to those of you who might be a little bit older, bicyclists, transit, and again, cars and trucks, right? When complete streets are about being inclusive of everyone and providing abilities for everyone to get around. One of the things that we want you to think about tonight as you're looking at these maps is communities often have missing teeth, missing buildings, parking lots maybe in places where there might be better served to have a building. But also think about connections. So this is a diagram, an illustration we drew in one of our projects where we were talking about doing small scale infill, but also thinking about how do we take larger blocks and make connections. So think about that as you're working on the map exercises tonight. Community gathering spaces. So making sure you have places. Here's a image of the pedestrian mall you have just right outside this building and the playground. And then 2 photographs from other places in the country. Think about those places to gather. A consistent thing we heard in the stakeholder meetings was we want walkability, whether it was the south side or the north side. But we also heard we want those places where the community can gather, right? Places that can happen. And we understand the north side has a lot of that as assets, but there's always the opportunity to add more. So think about that as you work on the maps tonight. So I talked about the commercial streets, but there's also the recognition that livable streets are really about thinking about residential streets as well. What is it that's the characteristics on your streets that make it friendly for you to walk down the sidewalk, to sit out on your porch, as we heard from stakeholders, sit out on your porch, have some tea, have some coffee, do some work, meet your neighbors. So again, it's about, in your community, we saw lots of stoops. We saw a lot of porches, right, along buildings. Those are important elements. The traffic generally runs slower. You have street trees. You have on-street parking. Oh. And so again, we've got a chance today to go out and photograph some buildings. We'll spend some time tomorrow photographing buildings. And hopefully I'll get a chance on Thursday to take some pictures. But again, we are just starting to really understand everything in the north side. We also recognize that you all, as a community, have done a huge amount of work in your plan, in your handbook, that you've gone out and you documented and you've recorded the history of a lot of these buildings. You have great details in both of these documents that will be really helpful for us. And so you have, in each of these districts, you talk about some of the history, the important parts of these different districts. So I won't go through each of these, but just, again, you have this wonderful resource that we want to work with you all to build upon. So with that, I'd like to ask Dan to come up and talk a little bit about some of the technical details.
Okay, so I'm going to take about 10 minutes here and go through a short version of what I presented last summer, last late spring here. Number one, touching on kind of this concept of what missing middle housing is. And then secondly, about what is form-based coding, just a really brief introduction. On the left-hand side of this diagram, in the far left, in the white buildings, are single-family detached housing. And right, we've created fairly good sort of regulatory zoning, planning, and there's a lot of builders that can deliver single-family housing. On the far right-hand side, the 4, 5, 6-story condos or apartment buildings, and over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, just both from a planning and a zoning perspective and even from a development perspective, and it shows here in your downtown, developers have figured those out. There's this broad range of housing in between that we call missing middle. It's a duplex, it's a fourplex, it's what we might call it a mansion apartment that might have 6 to 8 units, looks like a house, but just happens to have multiple units in it. Might be you don't actually have any examples of the cottage court or the bungalow court here, but we have seen them in places like Omaha, Norman, Oklahoma, a lot of different places that we have worked across the country. So the concept, and the reason that there's a lot of different reasons that these are classified as missing. It's because number one is because we haven't built very many of these types of housing over the course of the last 40 or even 50 years. Number one, a lot of times there's not a lot of opportunities in terms of what zoning allows for missing middle housing. It actually gets a little bit hard to finance if you get over 4 units because it becomes a commercially financed project. And we haven't really created an industry like we have with single family and even with the larger buildings that sort of delivers or builds these housing types. And so we've classified them as missing. And if you're going to go away from this presentation with one thought about missing middle housing, it's that it's a building that never gets bigger than the scale of a house. It just happens to have multiple units poured into that sort of volume of that house. And I will say that it's in a context like this, in a university town, which we've worked in many of them, there's obviously, the first question that'll come up is, well, what about existing single-family house that gets sort of divided up into multiple units? And so that's not necessarily the intent here with defining missing middle, but we know it's something specifically that we need to address in a place like Iowa City in terms of the impacts on the neighborhood, the benefits, the challenges, and what have you in the context of this larger conversation. But what I like to talk about, and this concept has caught on all across the country. This is a concept that I developed about 5 years ago, and we created that diagram. And even AARP is now using this concept as part of their age-friendly communities in terms of providing housing choices, specifically housing choices in walkable urban communities. Even the development and the building industry, the sort of Professional Builder magazine has taken this on and has me speaking in different parts of the country as well. But right, these really fine-grain sort of house scale buildings that happen to have a couple units in it. And I think part of the reason that the concept has caught on is it's given communities a way to talk about the need for providing diverse housing choices without talking about the scary D word. Does anybody know what the scary D word is? density, well, development, it can be that too, density, right, is a lot of these housing types actually generate pretty high density numbers, but if you just look at photos of them, you would not guess sort of that these are high density generating buildings. Because they're small footprint, scale of a house, typically not bigger than 2 or 2.5 stories, kind of a maximum width of 35 to 40 feet and a maximum depth as well. So they behave like a house. And so it's an important part of kind of the conversation. Stacked duplex, right? You go in this door, you go up a flight of stairs, and there's a flat on top. And you go in this door here, and it's a flat on the ground floor, right? Scale of a house, multiple units. Carriage house, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. If you walk up and down any of your alleys, there's variations of these carriage houses. They're just part of this vocabulary of thinking about housing choices. And we just need to discuss them in the context of discussion of assessing a neighborhood like this. Oops. The Fourplex. This is one of my favorites. And you see these, right, every different architectural style. Right, you have a unit on the left-hand side of the ground floor. You have a unit on the right-hand side of the ground floor. And if you go up a flight of stairs, there's 2 more stacked units on top. And this is actually an example from Dallas, Texas. And if you calculate the densities of a fourplex type like this, it usually generates densities of about 35 units per acre. Right? So that's why we don't like to start a conversation of housing in terms of density. We like to talk about what is the appropriate scale and form and how that building addresses the street. So it's just a really great example of a missing middle housing type. Now, I do want to say, right, we're not coming into this with the assumption that there's possible blanket application of missing middle to all of the areas of the Northside neighborhood. We're just simply saying that we have this idea of these missing middle types in our toolbox. We've seen some examples, and we're assessing whether or not or where these missing middle types may be a possible sort of tool to apply to different parts of the neighborhood. And so that's why we're here. We're just engaging that conversation. Multiplex small, right? If I didn't tell you that this was not a single family house, like, would you be able to tell that it wasn't a single family house, right? This is a triplex. Just looks and feels and behaves like a house. It happens to have multiple units in it. Really beautiful, newly built example in a community outside of Salt Lake City. And then a townhouse. And I think this is a pretty straightforward one. I just usually raise a little bit of a yellow flag on the townhouse because it can be a really great sort of walkable urban building type in the right locations. But it can also be very... it can be abused in a way that it actually is detrimental to the infill, that it's the areas that it's being infilled in terms of maybe orienting the units onto too small of a space between the buildings, not having orientation toward the street and what have you, but just a good type to have in our lexicon. I really, really like this type, and this is the last example I'm going to show. We call it a Livework Unit. And what I like about this type is in areas where you're transitioning from a commercial area, like your Northside commercial area, into a neighborhood. Because what it does is this is a 25-foot wide lot by, it can be 60 to 100 plus or minus feet deep. It has a flex space on the ground floor that has a separate entrance, but then it has a door here that takes you up to a townhouse unit. And what's really cool about this is in areas where you're not sure whether the market is there for more commercial ground floor uses, this can function as a studio apartment. It can function as an artist studio. It can function as an architect's office, right? There's quite a bit of flexibility, or it can become a full-blown coffee shop or retail use if the market's actually there for it. So it's a good place to transition from those areas where you want to require that ground floor commercial and retail, but you want that form, but you want to sort of give it a little bit of flexibility in terms of how the market's going to respond to it. And the cottage court, sorry, this is a little bit blurry, so I'm going to flip through that. Just a couple of examples, right? Historically, it's a little bit hard to see, but in the beige here are the missing middle types. And in a lot of the pre-1940s neighborhoods, these types were sprinkled throughout the neighborhood. And because they were the scale of a house, sort of and very compatible in scale. Like, unless you were walking and looking very carefully, you wouldn't actually notice that these were multi-unit buildings. So there was a nice blending. And I'm going to caveat that by the neighborhood that I live in. I live in a walkable neighborhood in Berkeley, California. I have a duplex. I live in a small lot, sort of 1,000 square foot historic bungalow. Right next to me is a duplex. And in one side of that duplex lives a couple about my age with a couple of small kids. And on the other side of the duplex lives their parents. And every day when I'm coming home from work, Grandpa and Grandma are out there pushing the stroller down the street. And how nice to, right, have that built-in sort of family, community, but yet separated. Right, there's just a lot of good reasons to be thinking about this. The other thing is, we found out the other day that my son's first grade teacher in the same neighborhood lives in a triplex. And in the second unit of that triplex lives her mom, who's another first grade teacher at the same school. And in the third unit of that triplex is her sister and brother-in-law, and her brother-in-law is my daughter's middle school PE teacher. So, right, it's part of this is providing affordable options within walking distance in this instance to those schools, so they can they can actually walk in those environments. So there's conditions where historically, right, there was a particular street where there was a mix of missing middle housing types, and then you turn around a corner and it might become primarily single family, right? And there might be places where you want to reinforce a pattern like that. And then there might be a pattern where maybe it's the edge of your downtown where you've allowed bigger buildings, you've allowed 5-6-story buildings. You turn around down a corner, and historically we see this a lot. A couple of the lots are, a fourplex or a duplex, and they kind of transition in scale. And then it becomes primarily single family. So they're a really great, we kind of knew how to do this in the 1900s and we forgot. And so part of this, especially in thinking about, the form-based code or thinking about refining your zoning, is thinking about how we might be able to apply these types in appropriate locations for transitions or to provide that range of housing types, right? Another instance, similar, turn a corner from a main street, couple of missing middle types serve as a transition into a single family neighborhood. So we could be thinking about that here as well. So form-based codes. And I'm going to say, first of all, don't get caught up in this title. It's just let me just go to this slide. It's just simply another way to think about writing effective development regulations. How many of you, if you want to Instagram or tweet or email a photograph to a friend or a family member, how many of you use a Polaroid camera for that effort? Right? Nobody. So the way I like to start this conversation is thinking about zoning, use-based zoning, and sort of 99% of cities across the country still have this. They're operating with a 100-year-old operating system. It's an out-of-date operating system for trying to effectively regulate for a historic neighborhood, for a neighborhood main street, for a transition from a downtown to a neighborhood, because there's a much more complex, the need for a more complex system or effective system for addressing sort of the nuances in sort of those existing conditions. And so I like to say that what a form-based code is, so I'm actually going to go to the next slide, John, is, right, it's the new operating system. It's about us understanding the conditions in your neighborhood really carefully and studying them, understanding the neighborhood's desired vision, whether it be preservation or conservation with a little bit of evolution, or maybe there's evolution in a little piece and where you might fill some lots and preservation in another piece. It's simply about sort of creating a system that's based on that desired form primarily, and the nuances of effectively regulating for those types of environments. And I know, I like to see it could be actually as easy as, instead of having a RS8 or an RS, 4 or a JBG3Z4. Austin, Texas, where we're currently working, actually had a string of, I think, 36 different letters in some of their zone districts because of all the different overlays. So this is about trying to simplify, but actually sharpen the instruments for effectively regulating for these types of historic neighborhoods and the transitions into the downtown area. Next, John. I just want to say this is what seems like a lifetime ago, I wrote a book on form-based coding. John Wiley & Sons is the publisher, but we defined a three-step process that I just wanted to mention really briefly. The first step of it, which is very different than a conventional approach to zoning, is about studying and analyzing the place. We take pictures, we do a lot of mapping, we walk the neighborhoods, and really feel that's the necessary foundation for this type of a coding effort. Then the second thing is actually a visioning process. And instead of, we say that you need a vision in place first before you actually try to write the rules for regulating something. And so we actually, in this particular process, are going to stop at this point of actually making a recommendation for next steps and possible applications. But whenever we do this, and if you kind of just Google form-based code, you'll see that it's usually tied to working very closely with the neighborhood to reinforce a vision you have and maybe make tweaks to that, because I know you guys have spent a lot of time and energy doing that, and then putting the code together to implement that vision effectively. And one other thing that I want to say is that a lot of times we go into a community and they have an overcomplicated system because, like I said, they were trying to use the Polaroid camera. And so, the base zoning district was not creating the right kind of development. And that's exactly why your historic districts popped up, initially at least. And we see that everywhere. And then places like Austin, they didn't stop at the historic overlay. They did urban design overlay. They did 15 other overlays to the point where the system was just, we called it broken. It wasn't working. It wasn't effective, impossible to understand. So what we like to say is when we're doing a form-based code, as much of that really good intent that you all have spent a lot of time and energy on, we try to compress as much of that intent as we can into a new set of form-based zoning districts. So usually the historic overlay still exists because there's a lot of really detailed architectural elements, materials, windows, and stuff that we wouldn't necessarily put in a zoning code. But a lot of the site standards in terms of the size of the building, the lot placement, orientation to the street, we actually compress that and put that into a new form-based zone district. So this is going to look very different. I know you've done a form-based code south of downtown, so you're a little bit more familiar than a lot of places. A lot of a form-based code is also about clarity and predictability, The form-based code would look like this, Lots of graphics and very simplified, taking paragraph after paragraph of text and putting into tables and tying that to the graphics. Oops. The other thing that's important is we're not just picking numbers out of thin air in terms of a density or a FAR, floor area ratio, or setbacks. We actually test case studies on individual lot sizes in your neighborhoods. And I know that there's pretty limited sort of infill opportunities in the north side, but we still, we take what opportunities might be out there and assess those standards on those individual lots and then back into those regulations. This is just an example, is in one community we worked in, they had this 50 by 150 foot lot. And this is not architecture, this is just a massing diagram, but this city zoning code actually allowed this as a single family house in a historic neighborhood. And I think everybody in that city, it was really clear this was not compatible. This is not what they wanted. This is what their zoning allowed. They were pretty shocked to actually see sort of what allowed. And then we take a step back and the intent isn't just to allow, this was an area that was actually zoned for multiple units on a lot. So we said, the other thing is if you go through this, they had a process of going through a zoning amendment and got a couple extra units approved, You could, the developer could develop something that looked like this, and everybody once again agreed that this is not what they want. But then we said, well, let's think about a fourplex, a missing middle fourplex. And right? This would actually, in this context, give the builder one more unit than that previous example, but it gives the neighborhood what it wants in terms of a building that's reinforcing the streets, vibrant streetscape, the scale. And, maybe the trade-off is there's an extra, the bar is raised a little bit on the architecture quality because it's in a historic neighborhood or something of that sort. So that's the way we like to have this conversation, just show some very generalized examples. So what you'll see is if you pick up some examples of form-based codes, this is one we did for Cincinnati, Ohio. Once again, they're very graphic, and these represent new zoning districts, form-based zoning districts. And we usually have a really simple three-dimensional graphic at the front that is a graphic intent of each of those form-based districts. And so it goes from the least intense, which is these are single-family detached houses, kind of medium to large-sized lots, medium-sized setbacks. And as you work your way across to the right, lots get a little bit smaller, buildings get a little bit closer, and maybe it jumps up a height or two. So you can see by the time that it gets over here, it's kind of a quintessential Cincinnati neighborhood with attached or slightly detached townhouses, kind of 2 or 3 foot setback off the front of the street with no side setbacks. And then it goes up to sort of downtown scale, sort of downtown edge scale, and then downtown. So just wanted to give you a little bit of a glimpse. Now, what I'll say is that you don't have to be worried. Form-based coding still has use tables. I think one of the misconceptions out there is because form-based code is regulating form primarily, that it doesn't regulate use. But we still do regulate use. It's just secondary as opposed to the primary intent. So in a neighborhood, we wouldn't allow commercial uses in a residential neighborhood. Just being very specific where we want those uses as well. Sorry, I'm just going to skip over this because I'm talking a little bit too much. A couple of last things is wanted to introduce the idea of frontage type. And this is how a building sort of interacts and interfaces with the sidewalk or the street. And it's actually really, really important, in most zoning codes ignore this, right? Because most zoning codes, without a historic preservation overlay, obviously, they can't see the difference between this building or this building because it's the same height, it's the same setback, and it's the same density. So, right, it really does matter that not only do you have a door on the street, we saw a lot of projects today that had a door on the street, but didn't really meet the intent of having a door and windows on the street. And, you can do that through a historic preservation overlay, or you could do it directly in a form-based code by regulating a set of what we call frontage type. So just something to think about, right? Another context, this was at the heart of a main street of a small town that we did some work in. And so this is the main street. Do you think this condition here along the sidewalk is encouraging any sort of shopping or walking at all? No, right? First of all, windows would be nice along the main street. Second of all, can't walk side by side, can't get a wheelchair through here, right? Just there's a lot of bad things about it. And if you don't regulate it, you'll get these conditions. And I think Iowa City has some of these examples, right, too, where you just need to be thoughtful about how you regulate that. Yes?
That is also a very hazardous type of area because there's shadows at night. And
Public safety.
Built-in trip hazard.
Yep.
And there's crime.
Absolutely. Public safety is something that needs to be thought about in this process as well. And so we're going to talk a lot about building types, as I did with the missing middle housing types as the core ingredients. But what I'd like to say is that each of the new form-based districts in a code that we write, this is from Cincinnati again, allows a range of housing types. So you can see these are mostly missing middle types: duplex, row house, multiplex, small live-work unit. And you think of it as the building types as the ingredients of a neighborhood, right? Every neighborhood has a mix of different housing types within a certain range. And that's the way that we like to think about and how we like to regulate those environments. So as John mentioned, we do have Rick Chelman on our team. It's a little less applicable here to the north side compared to our work in the south side, but I mean, some ways you're really fortunate because you have the street network in place, you have the natural traffic calming in the brick roads and the sort of the ups and downs in your brick streets, but we do think very closely about how the design of the streets impacts and benefits the walkability of a neighborhood as we go through a process like this.